got it. So welcome once again to our Spring Goodspeed Lectures. I'm Dr. Maya Petrositz, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Phil Harland. Dr. Phil Harland is a full professor of humanities and ancient history at York University. What, is somebody listening? At York University in Toronto. His work as a social historian of the ancient Mediterranean has been engaged across a number of fields: religion, classics, and ancient history. His work on associations or small group formations in the Greco-Roman world, particularly as they pertain to Judeans and Christ followers, has given social complexity and a kind of practical, material concreteness to Judeans and Christ followers, which were and often still are imagined as somehow floating above or unique within their ancient social context. Dr. Harland is currently working on his fourth book, one on the responses of cultural minorities in the ancient world to dominant ethnic hierarchies. And he also runs a popular podcast for the public, Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean. So please welcome Dr. Phil Harland.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me to come. What I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the cultural history of Satan. Satan has become and continues to be a sort of important cultural concept that we take for granted. And the thing about him is he had an origin, sort of emerged at a particular moment in cultural history. And so today I'm going to be talking about that moment when we first catch a glimpse of people, Judeans in this case, having this concept of a personified evil figure. And it begins to emerge around 200 BCE. We'll see that we first catch a glimpse of someone thinking in those terms. But what I want to do beyond that, I want to give you a sense of what cultural context this idea of personified evil fits within, and give you a sense of the apocalyptic worldview. Many of you know about apocalypse, and we have post-apocalyptic films, so you'll sort of get the concept of apocalypticism already, but I'll give you a little bit more sense of what apocalypticism is, and then that is Satan's home. In a way, apocalypticism doesn't work without Satan. So that will be the first main point I hope to get across to you using a document called First Enoch. So First Enoch was written by a Judean around 200 BCE. The second main point I hope to get across to you is that this is the idea of Satan, or Belial, or Mastema, a personified evil figure opposed to God, is not just an idea in people's heads. We have clear evidence that some Judean groups, lived out this worldview and believed very strongly in it, and that it actually had an impact on social interactions between people, within the group and between the group and people outside. So we'll be looking at that as my second main point. I'll use the Dead Sea Scrolls to try and give you a sense of that. The third point I hope to get across to you has to do with a little more of the nitty-gritty of the functions of Satan within those interactions. So Satan's not just an idea in people's heads. It has impact in how people behave. And so I want to show you the functions of Satan within those interactions, both in the social interactions and in the rhetorical sort of situations. So I'm going to use the book of Revelation to help give you a glimpse of that. In other words, someone using the rhetoric of Satan, in this case to demonize other people that belong quite close to their own group, but also to demonize people outside the group. This internal and external functions of Satan that is the third main thing I hope to get across to you guys today. So I'm going to use three documents to do that. So first Enoch, community rule from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then the book of Revelation, a couple of chapters in there. Now, having said we're going to do that, this is only getting a bare glimpse into all kinds of things that are there that we won't have time for today. And we'll see if I even get through all the material that I've got ready for you here. But what I hope you get is just an inkling as to each of those three main points I was making. Where did Satan kind of come from? Apocalyptic context. Secondly, it's not just an idea in people's heads. It's groups that lived out the belief in that. And then finally, how did that function in social and rhetorical situations? Okay? So that's what I hope you get out of it, even if we don't get through all the material. The song I was playing as we were just waiting there, you can go through later. In fact, you can look at all these notes here. If you write down, if you go to philharland.com and then go to the first blog entry, you'll be able to get back to this later. And so you can listen to the song again, you can read the different materials that I've got linked there. So don't feel afraid to go back there and learn more if we run out of time to cover things. But anyways, that first song I was playing for you, Sympathy for the Devil, from 1968, by the Rolling Stones, sort of captures something. First of all, it shows you that Satan is still a figure, so much so that people would write songs that build a somewhat sophisticated understanding of Satan within the song. And so this song portrays history through the eyes of Satan. And Satan speaks to you in the first person, talking about the things he caused. And basically the song is about how the Russian Revolution is caused by Satan, Hitler is caused by Satan, and a variety of other things. But take a look at that again later when you get home if you want. But it really shows you the function of Satan in that song is quite close to the ideological function. We're going to talk about social functions, we're going to talk about rhetorical functions, but ideological function of Satan that we see in the song is quite close to what the ideological function of Satan was the very first time we see him in ancient Judean literature. And that is the ideological function of explaining evil, right? So this idea of a personified evil figure that embodies evil and that is opposed to God is at the heart of this whole concept here. And it's a way of, in some ways, ideologically distancing God from evil. Because you have, this is a new idea, that there's an opposing figure to God that can help to explain bad things happening, as opposed to God being responsible for that. See how that's sort of a distancing ideological function? But anyhow, that's the song has that as its main focus, and that's exactly what Satan functions as in the earliest document we have that has him as a personified evil figure. So that's why I wanted to play that song. Let me talk a little bit now about this first point. I'm going to use 1 Enoch soon to explain the origins of Satan, but I need to give you a little bit of context about where Satan comes from. Basically, you have in the Hebrew Bible, those of you who've taken the Bible course here, you might have come across the book of Job. So in the book of Job, we already have a figure that could be translated as the Satan. He could also be translated as simply the prosecutor or the adversary. So there's an adversarial figure in the book of Job. In the book of Job, remember, is probably written either in the exilic period in the 500s BCE or possibly earlier, possibly a little bit later, but before we have a personified evil figure. 200 BCE, I'm going to suggest to you, is when you get Satan as a personified evil figure, right? 200, not the time of Job. But in Job, you have the Satan. It is an adversarial angelic figure that's not an adversary against God. Ultimately, that's what our personified evil Satan is, right? It's a figure that has a will that is opposed to what God wants to achieve, and therefore, source of evil. But when you have these earlier references to the Satan, the adversarial figure, in the Hebrew Bible and places like Job, it's an angel that is actually doing the will of God. It's not an adversary against God. It's God's prosecutor in a sort of court setting, so to speak, right? Working on behalf of God as a prosecutor, as an adversary. And so that's quite a different concept of the Satan that you get in the Hebrew Bible than what you get in the post-Hebrew Bible period, which is what we're looking at. That's when the evil personified figure emerges. So I hope you get that out of this first point I'm making, that there's a certain point at which there's a different concept of Satan that becomes what we now know as the evil personified figure opposed to God. There are many predecessors of Satan. In other words, despite the fact that it's only beginning in around 200 BCE that we first catch a glimpse of Judeans
believing in a personified evil figure opposed to God. It's only in 200. But despite that, there's many predecessors from before that, cultural predecessors, that if you read through the Hebrew Bible, you'll find all kinds of things that later get attached to the personified evil figure of Satan, including that adversary figure in Job, including the monster Leviathan that you'll encounter in different parts of the Hebrew Bible. These things later converge on the personified evil figure once they have that idea. But before that, obviously, they're separate ideas. And so there's many predecessors I won't have time for, but I just quickly mentioned them up there. Another thing too, there's a lot of Israelite, Hebrew sort of context predecessors, but there's also ones from other cultural contexts. Zoroastrianism, which we won't have a lot of time to talk about, is an Iranian cultural sort of context. And in that case, Zoroastrianism may be the first, there's debates because our sources are dated later, but if Zoroaster is either dated to the 1200s BCE or the 600s BCE, right? So that may predate when Jews have an apocalyptic worldview. So we're not sure what came first, but there's definitely some relationship between Zoroastrian apocalypticism, and I'm going to explain what apocalypticism is in a moment, and this idea of an opposition between Ahura Mazda, the good God, and Angra Mainyu, the opposing force. There's a very clear dualism, in other words, two things opposed to one another within Iranian Zoroastrianism. And there's some relationship between that and the emerging Judean concept of two forces opposed to one another, Satan and God, or Mastema and God, or Belial and God. You take your favorite name for Satan. And there's some relationship there, and we just don't know exactly what it is. You probably don't have a favorite name for Satan, but anyways, that was a joke. The function of Satan in this apocalyptic worldview that I'm going to explain now is precisely to explain where evil comes from. And the fallen angel story of First Enoch is what I'm going to get into soon. But let me move on to explaining a little bit about the apocalyptic worldview. You guys might know some of this, but let me nonetheless expand on what you may already know. I've got some art that obviously post-dates anything we're studying here, that's actually based on the sort of literature we're looking at, especially the book of Revelation, but that depicts sort of episodes in the story of Satan, right? And this first one being Satan and his angels being cast out of heaven by Dore. Let me explain Judean apocalypticism. Remember, I'm just using Judean as it's maybe a more accurate way of translating what we often translate as Jude, right? Judean versus Jude. It's the same thing we're talking about here, right? So instead of saying Jews, I'll say Judeans. Instead of saying something's Jewish, I'll say it's Judean, to give you that sort of geographical, cultural, ethnic element to what's going on with this, right? And so when I explain Judean apocalypticism, I'm explaining Jewish apocalypticism. I won't go off on a huge tangent explaining the fact that in the ancient world, they did not have the category of religion. And that we might, if we use the word Judaism, we might think of the category of religion, right? That we might be thinking we're talking about, if we're talking about Judaism and Christianity, we're talking about religions. This is a modern way of talking, and in the ancient context, things are primarily expressed in ethnic terms more so. They just don't have the category of religion. They don't have that as a concept, as a separate thing that someone might do. So that's part of why I use that word, Judean. So I did say something, but anyways. Now, let me give you a sense of the context now of Judean apocalypticism in this point right here. So in the post-exilic period, so remember that back in Israelite history, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians, and around 721 BC. Then the southern kingdom, that is where Judea is, where Judah is, and Jerusalem is, and the temple falls to the Babylonians. Remember that? In 586 BCE? And then we call the period after that the Exile, because the upper classes of Judea in 586 BCE get taken away to Babylonia, don't they? And so when they're in Babylonia, this is sort of the context in which this idea of Judean apocalypticism probably starts to emerge, and that's in the 500s BCE, but we only first catch a glimpse of it in 200 BCE. So it's hard to know where between the 500s and 200 this sort of new set of ideas, including evil personified, emerges, and Judean apocalypticism emerges in this period. Having said it emerges in this period, it's not that suddenly every Judean you would meet, every Jew you would meet would be apocalyptic. No. It's a certain segment of Judean culture thinks like this. So don't mistake what I'm explaining today for an explanation of ancient Judean culture or Judaism. We're just looking at one particular strand of it. And it's within that Judean apocalyptic strand of Judean culture that Satan emerges and has his home. Okay? Let me give you some sense of what apocalypticism is before we look at the first document where we see it most clearly emerging. A person who thinks apocalyptically thinks like this: I'm living in an evil age dominated by evil powers. There's a constant battle between God and an opposing force. I might call the opposing force Satan, might call him the devil, might call him Leviathan, might call him the dragon, might call him Mastema, might call him Belial. There's all kinds of different options there. There's a lot of multivalent. Satan is multivalent, despite some commonalities, but I'm explaining commonalities. I'm living in an evil age, dominated by evil powers, but God has a plan to finish the battle and win the battle against the opposing force, the evil personified force. In the midst of the battle, though, humans take sides in the battle, right? Humans aren't just, oh yeah, there's a battle up there going on. The idea of an apocalyptic thinker is that I'm part of the battle. We are part of the battle. We take sides. We are either the sons of light or the sons of darkness. We are either wicked or righteous. And we're part of the battle. We're either on the side of Satan or on the side of God. This is how an apocalyptic thinker thinks, right? And so this is what we're about to see, the time it emerges, and who the first sort of case of this emerging. Another element in this, though, is that God has a plan, as I mentioned, right? There's predeterminism. The idea that God already knows what's going to take place and he has a plan to do it at a particular time is quite important to this way of thinking. Not only that, but when the time comes that God planned to do that intervention, to finish the battle, he's going to wipe out evil and destroy Satan, and he's going to reward the righteous. It's this idea of the wicked being destroyed along with Satan, and the righteous being rewarded and given a perfect place to live is essential to this way of thinking as well, right? So all of this is just one strand of Judean culture, remember. Not what everyone thought, but one strand. And in that context, I should mention to you, if you look through the Hebrew Bible and study Israelite culture, you'll see that there's an absence of even a notion of an afterlife. The Hebrew Bible really doesn't have an interest in or a developed notion of an afterlife. That's what emerges precisely in connection with the Judean apocalyptic worldview. The idea that there's going to be an afterlife where the righteous are rewarded is part of this worldview, right? Okay, I've given you that basic framework. Another thing, though, that an apocalyptic thinker believes is this: God reveals secrets to special people. And what are those secrets that God reveals to special people? The worldview I just explained. That we're living in an evil world dominated by Satan, that God has a plan, to reveal, to come and intervene and wipe out evil forever, and to reward the righteous and to destroy the wicked, and to destroy Satan along with the wicked. So that whole worldview is combined with the idea that God reveals that to very particular people. And so the documents in which we read of this worldview are the people who believe God has told them this. And we often, and scholars would often call these documents either apocalyptic writings or even the genre of the apocalypse, right? So the book of Revelation is an example of this. Visionary expression of God's plan to destroy evil and to destroy Satan and set up a perfect kingdom. I've already mentioned Satan has many names. So let's move on to one of those names. Actually, two of them. The earliest document we have that comes closest to expressing a somewhat developed notion of apocalypticism like I just outlined is 1 Enoch. Okay? And in 1 Enoch, there are two different angels that sort of are the Satan figure. It seems that the author of 1 Enoch, who's writing around 200 BCE, is working with earlier stories and combining them together. Because when you read this document when you get home, you'll find out there's two different head angels, and it seems almost like he's trying to smush together two different stories about rebel angels who go against the will of God, etc., right? And one of them's Shemahaza, and the other one's Asahel, the head angels that are involved in this particular document. So that's the name of Satan, so to speak. The earliest time we encounter an evil personified figure that's an angel that rebels against God is in 1 Enoch, first time we encounter it in history. And it's these guys, Shemahaza and Asahel. 1 Enoch, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about him, what it is, but it's a document around 200 BC, written as though it's the figure of Enoch from the Hebrew Bible. So a person taking on the persona of someone from before the time of Noah, a Judean, taking on the persona of Enoch, and writing this revelation that God has told him about what the plans of God are and about what occurred. What 1 Enoch uses is a story that does exist in the Hebrew Bible. This story right here. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, from Genesis we're reading here, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were... What did they see? That the sons of God saw that they were fair. That's what they saw. And they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Now, this is in the Genesis narrative, right? Here, there's nothing referring to rebel angels who end up being an evil personified figure. But what 1 Enoch does is read this passage of Genesis and expand it and builds into it the origins of Satan, right? The reason he does it is he wants to explain why humankind was wicked. So the ideological function of this first story of the rebel angels, in this case using the story of angels coming down to mate with humans from Genesis, is precisely to explain how did evil come into the world? And why, therefore, would God need to send a flood to try and reverse the things he had done? So, 1 Enoch, the author writing in 200 BC, is trying to figure out the conundrum here, right? Why does God suddenly want to wipe all of humanity out? Well, it just blatantly says he's wicked in Genesis, but why were they wicked? Where did wickedness come from? Where did evil come from? How did humans get evil, is what the author of 1 Enoch wants to answer. And his answer was, they got evil by the things that the fallen angels taught them. Okay? Let me give you a little couple passages from 1st Enoch to show you the development of this little passage in Genesis into what will become the story of Satan. This is the beginning sort of emergence of that story, and it gets built up more and more after 200 BCE, but we're seeing the first glimpse of it. This is the expansion of Genesis that 1st Enoch has. Shemahazah, their chief, said to them, to his fellow 200 angels, I fear that you will not want to do this deed. They're planning on going to mate with the women. And I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. So here you have Shemahazah, the head angel that's rebelling against God here, along with 200 other angels, making an oath to follow through on this plan to do something that is not part of God's will. So Shemahazah is one of these sort of Satan figures, right? Now, this document combines two different traditions, it seems, because then you come across the story of Asahel, and it sounds like he's the head angel. Asahel taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed the metals of the earth and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. And he showed them concerning antimony, and he gave makeup. They taught makeup to humans, and all manner of precious stones and dyes. So this Asahel story is that the sin of the angels is introducing violence to humanity and lust to humanity. And that violence and lust are the reason that God's going to need to judge humanity. And then you know that in Genesis, right next comes the flood. But for 1st Enoch, all of this isn't just about the story of the flood, is it? It's a prototypical story for the whole history of humanity. That there's going to be judgment like the flood at the end of time, right? And so this is a far grander sort of scheme that or sort of broader story that the author has in mind here. In 1st Enoch, you'll also have the incipient hell. Let's see what happens. The idea of judging these angels who have gone against the will of God and have mated with the humans and taught the humans violence and taught the humans lust. And the idea of God needing to judge them comes very clearly in here, and it's the sort of language you later have for hell. So here, the Raphael, one of the angels that's on God's side, is talking. And God's talking to the angel. Go, Raphael, and bind Asahel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness and make an opening in the wilderness. Throw him in there and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones and cover him with darkness and let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover up his face and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment, he will be led away to the burning conflagration and heal the earth which the watchers have desolated, the angels have desolated, and announce the healing of the earth that the plague may be healed. And all the sons of men may not perish because of the mystery of that the watchers told and taught their sons. He calls those angels watchers. But anyhow, you have this idea of putting Asahel, the angel, in the ground. This is the origins of hell, the idea of Satan being in the ground that we're getting here. And it continues. I can't go into more of the details on that, but you also have Shemahazah having a similar fate and being put into a fiery abyss and tortured forever in this document. So this idea of God's sort of final plan to how to deal with that angelic will opposed to God, the satanic sort of figure that we're getting at first in 1st Enoch. Let's move on because we don't have all the time in the world. But something I want to note to you right now is this point here. And it's an issue that Judeans and then Jesus followers after them continue to try and figure out how to configure this. But do we explain, this is the question they ask, how do we explain evil? To what degree is evil a cosmic thing that originates in the cosmic realm outside of humanity? And to what degree is evil something that originates within humans? To what degree is it the choice of humanity that evil exists? And to what degree is it not the choice of humanity that evil exists? And this is an issue that's always here in the story of Satan, with different authors answering it differently. But you can see in the case of First Enoch that, at least in the way he interprets the fallen angel story, is that evil originates primarily in the cosmic realm. It's angels that came and taught humans how to act badly. Later on, already you have in Genesis the Adam and Eve story, where it's humans making a choice to do something. Later on, Satan's going to be plugged into that story, though, too, right? Remember that in the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve and the garden and the snake, there's no reference to Satan whatsoever. But once you have the developed notion of Satan, it's going to move back in the timeline. First Enoch has the introduction of evil just before the flood. Later on, people who tell the story of Satan are going to move it back to Adam and Eve. And then we're going to see today, even, someone who moves it back to God himself creating the evil personified figure. So there's different answers they have. There's variations here, right? Despite the fact there's commonalities. Let's move on to a group that illustrates the fact that these aren't just ideas in people's heads. The idea of an evil personified figure opposed to God isn't just an idea. It's something that gets acted out on. Unfortunately, we don't have many examples of entire groups that we know the entire group was very focused on this apocalyptic worldview. We have authors. We have First Enoch, where we just have the piece of literature he wrote, and we don't know whether or not First Enoch had a whole lot of buddies that agreed with him about these two angels and how God has got a battle with these opposing forces to God. We don't know. We just have some loner, maybe. We don't know. Maybe just a loner. But we have two main examples where we do know in the earliest stage, back in the origins in this first couple centuries here, where we do have examples of Judeans as a group together living out this apocalyptic worldview, believing it as a group, and actually organizing their social life around this belief and living in an evil age dominated by a satanic power, right? One of those groups is the Dead Sea sect that left the area of Jerusalem and went out to live on the Dead Sea around 150 BCE, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls supply us with a glimpse into one of these groups or communities that actually lives out this way of thinking, that takes Satan seriously. It's not just an idea. Another set of groups are the Jesus followers, right? A good number of the Jesus follower groups are examples of a group of people thinking apocalyptically, believing there's an evil power opposed to God, and living out this apocalyptic worldview. So you can study the New Testament and see an example of a Judean group expanding to include non-Judeans that has this way of thinking. But right now I'm going to look at the Dead Sea sect as an example of this. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the more important documents for understanding the community's life is known as the community rule. Quite literally, this document, among the scrolls that were found in the caves on the Dead Sea area, this community rule is literally a rule for how the community is to live their life together, right? Live their lives together. It's just totally saturated with this apocalyptic worldview, right? And I'm going to be getting into that in a moment. But I should give you a little bit of context. Where did these guys come from? So these guys that are out on the, and it is primarily guys, although a few women were found buried in the excavated graves that were found here. It's primarily men that belong to this community, it seems. And these guys were living among other Judeans, normally, so to speak, in Judea, and got upset about the way the temple was being run. They felt that other Judeans were not running the temple properly, to the point they felt we have to either change the way the temple's being run and get it back to being properly run the way God outlines in the law, in the Torah, or we got to get the hell out of here and get away from the evil system where the temple is not being run properly. And they chose to get the hell out of there. They went out into the desert and founded this sectarian community, right? They think of other Judeans as the evil people. It's not just, say, Romans or Hellenistic kings that they think are evil. They think other Judeans are evil and aren't running the temple properly. The priests in charge of the temple aren't doing things right. And so if you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll come across the guy, the wicked priest. From the Dead Sea sect's perspective, there was a particular priest that was extra wicked, one of the Hasmoneans. We can't go into them. But those of you guys who know the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, it's one of those guys that they thought of as a wicked priest, that the temple itself was evil, being run by wicked priests. You're already getting a glimpse in that whole scenario there of the social function soon that Satan does. And one is to demonize fellow people of your own group. In this case, Judeans demonizing other Judeans, right? And so we get that in the Dead Sea Scrolls to some degree, and I'll get into that soon. So these guys go out into the desert around 150 BCE because they can't stand how evil Jerusalem is and how evil the current Judean leadership of the temple is. And they want to live a life properly, in their view, according to what the Torah outlines. They want to be very strict about following the Judean Torah, the rules and the covenant that God made with his people. They want to go out in the desert and follow it properly. They're hoping for a time when a new perfect temple, not run by a wicked priest, will be set up. And so that's sort of the scenario here. In the community rule that outlines their activities and their rules, they begin by saying every year we need to have a covenant renewal where the group as a whole sits together and says, we are a special group who are against the wickedness of the rest of Judean society, and where we reaffirm our strict following of the covenant God has made with us. And so that's how the community rule begins, by talking about the ceremony they have every year to renew the membership and renew their dedication to what they believe. The ceremony itself has Belial as central. Belial is a word that just means worthless one. It's another name for Satan. And so the ceremony they had was expressed primarily in terms of opposition to the personified evil figure. And that their whole community life was centered around opposition to wickedness in the form of personified evil, the worthless one, Belial. Paul once uses the word Beliar. You guys may have come across that. So there, Paul was using a very similar term for a personified evil figure that the Dead Sea sect does. Let me read you a little snippet of this, the part that's to do with that ceremony they have to renew things. All those who enter the rule of the community shall establish a covenant before God in order to carry out all that he commands and in order to not stray from following him for any fear, dread, grief, or agony that might occur during the dominion of Belial. So their terminology, they use this phrase over and over again, the dominion of Belial. This is their apocalyptic way of talking about that central thing about the apocalyptic worldview. We're living in an evil age. How do they talk about the world in which they live? It's the dominion of Belial, the dominion of Satan. They're currently in the evil age dominated by the power of Belial. The ceremony then goes on, though, to try and express in ceremonial form, in the social group together, acting out through ritual, their condemnation and rejection of Belial. This is what they instruct the Levites, in other words, the priestly people among this group, are supposed to say. And the Levites shall curse all the men of the lot of Belial. They shall begin to speak and shall say, accursed are you for all your wicked, blameworthy deeds. May God hand you over to dread, into the hands of all those carrying out acts of vengeance. Accursed without mercy for the darkness of your deeds, and sentenced to the gloom of everlasting fire. May God not be merciful when you entreat him, nor pardon you when you do penance for your faults. May he lift the countenance of his anger to avenge himself on you, and may there be no peace for you in the mouth of those who intercede. Notice who's being condemned here. They believe they're living in the Belial's dominion, and obviously personified evil opposed to God is being condemned, but they're talking about the people, actual people, that are on the side of Belial that are being condemned here, right? The focus isn't even on Belial quite as much as it does on the people on the side of Belial. The Dead Sea sect and followers of Jesus later on have a very sort of embodied way of understanding the existence of Satan. Humans are part of that battle between God and Satan. Humans are on the side of Satan. And here they're demonizing, it's another way of putting it, right? Demonizing other human beings. In this case, they're talking about other Judeans, right? They're not talking about Greeks or Romans on this occasion here. They're talking about the other Judeans who don't run the temple properly, right? And they're being talked about as having future destruction and everlasting fire because they're on Belial's side. A few other things that come out in the Dead Sea Scrolls that I'll have to be brief about. And this is somewhat common among some of the apocalyptic literature. And that is the belief that when God, and you know how we said that God has a plan to end this evil age, and he's going to intervene, and he's predetermined when that happens. Sometimes these apocalyptic thinkers have particular figures that play a role in bringing about God's intervention, right? Sometimes those figures are anointed ones. The Hebrew word Messiah, and the Greek word Christos, right? And so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed there would be a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah that God would send at the last moment when he was going to wipe out evil and wipe out Belial to set up a perfect kingdom for the righteous to live in. And so within the Jesus followers are the ones that identify Jesus as that sort of end time figure who will help to bring about God's final intervention to wipe out evil. So it's an important component in the Dead Sea Scrolls way of thinking as well, that idea of end time figures who will help bring about God's plan. So there I hope you've got, even though we're having to race through some of this, you've got the idea of people living it out. You've already got the ideas there, a personified evil figure opposed to God, and that this is central to the apocalyptic worldview, expecting God to intervene to set up a perfect kingdom. We now have seen that there's people that live it out socially and actually think it's something they're participating in. The Dead Sea sect even has a manual for how to fight with the good angels in the final battle between the sons of light and sons of darkness. So they actually believe they're going to take part in the battle when God intervenes. So you've got an idea of the sort of reality of it for some of these Judeans. Now let's look at how these things develop and the functions that this plays. In a way, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you already get the two functions I'm going to explain in connection with Revelation. You get the function of Satan, the rhetoric of Satan, in other words, the talk of Satan functioning to demonize, to cast as wicked other people in your own group. The Judeans, the Dead Sea sect, demonizing other Judeans and saying, you Judeans are on the side of Belial. You Judeans are on the side of Satan. So you already saw that. Internal sort of usage of the rhetoric of Satan to demonize other people that are part of your group, or at least an extended group, right? The other thing that's we didn't touch on a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that also is there when you read through them, is demonizing foreign powers. Demonizing the Romans, demonizing the Hellenistic kings, and talking about kings as being on the side of Belial, right? These two functions are already there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now I'm going to expand on them in relation to the book of Revelation as an example. But they illustrate the sort of social and rhetorical functions of this rhetoric, of the idea of Satan functioning in your battles with people, right? I'll be brief here. I wish I had time today, and in the class, I'm going to be in one of the classes tomorrow, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, written probably sometime shortly after 70 CE, written by a Judean who believes Jesus is a Judean Messiah, but written by a Judean, ended up in your New Testaments, as you know, at the end of your New Testament, called Revelation in there. This document from the late first century really brings together a whole lot of different components of the story of Satan and builds on it and expands it, the story of Satan in particular ways. And we can't go into that right now because I'm focused on the functions of it right now, right? But I've listed a few examples of the things that come up in connection with the Satan figure within Revelation, and it combining things like Leviathan together with other aspects of the fallen angel story and all that, which we can talk about in that other class. What I want to do right now, though, is use Revelation very briefly to explain these two main functions that I've already alluded to. The function of demonizing people that are close to you and characterizing them as on the side of Satan, and then demonizing external powers. John's Revelation really gives you a very clear case of both these sort of styles of using Satan in order to accomplish something socially and rhetorically. First of all, let's look at the opening letters. John's Apocalypse is a visionary account, right? It's the author claiming to have had visions, sitting down, writing what those visions were. And in the first set of visions, the vision is of an angel who is dictating letters. So the opening of John's Revelation are a series of letters that he receives supposedly through the vision he has. In those letters, it's dealing with the churches in Asia Minor. You guys have heard of probably Asia Minor before, Turkey. So John's Apocalypse, he's writing to communities of Jesus followers in Western Turkey. Places like Smyrna and Ephesus and Pergamum, those places, right? And in those letters, he deals with people he likes, the author does, or the visions do, and the visions and the author deal with people he does not like. And the people he does not like, guess what he calls them? Demonic, satanic, those types of things, right? And different words than that. Let me give you two examples. First of all, you have repeated references to the synagogue of Satan when this author talks about the people that are part of the Jesus movement, or at least part of Judean culture in Turkey. Remember, there's diaspora, there's Judeans, Jews settled in Turkey. And he characterizes these other Judeans or followers of Jesus as being on the side of Satan. Chapter 2, verses 8 and following in his letter to Smyrna. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Judeans and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So here you have the Judean author characterizing other Judeans as belonging to a synagogue of Satan, demonizing people that are sort of part of your group. A second example comes, a good example of this comes up in the Thyatira letter, chapter 2, 18 and following. Some of you are studying Jezebel in one of your courses, and this occurs here. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. Goes on and on about all the bad things about Jezebel, right? It's name calling, because Jezebel is a figure from the Hebrew Bible. prostitute sort of figure in the Hebrew Bible. And then it closes with this phrase about the people. Remember, these are followers of Jesus he's objecting to, who follow another leader. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets. Right? So he characterizes the teaching of another Jesus follower group, a leader of Jesus group, as Satan's teaching, demonizing someone that's part of your group, right? Starting to see how this functions? These two functions continue throughout history, and you can find them still today, right? Let's look at chapters 17 and following as another example, just because we're running out of time, of, in this case, demonizing an external power. Let me at least get another photo up here. Famous piece by William Blake illustrating chapters 17 and 18 of John's Revelation, right? Depicting Babylon the whore. Now, obviously the choice of the word Babylon the whore gives you a clue as to what's going on in the rhetoric here, right? And the idea of Rome being Babylon is widespread after the second destruction of the temple, because the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, remember? In 586 BCE, the Babylonians came in and destroyed temple number 1. They built a new temple in around 500 and following. And then the Romans come in 66 to 70, have a war, kill tens of thousands of Judeans, and destroy the temple. So for this reason, this idea of Babylon as the model of the evil empire is very common among Judeans in this author's time period, right? And so he adopts that. And so here he's really talking about Rome, the current political power, as Babylon the whore. He also explicitly has visions that he recounts. He explicitly talks about a vision of a beast. And he gets into details about the beast that reveal that he thinks of the beast as a symbol of the emperors, the Roman emperors. And he's thinking of Nero specifically, the Emperor Nero, as one of the horns of the beast. And if you look at these chapters when you get home, because we're running out of time, we can't look at it in detail, but look at chapters 12 to 13 and 17 to 18 when you get home. You'll see the way in which this author goes out of his way to associate both Rome itself, Rome's emperors, associate them together with Babylon, and then associate all that together with Satan. So the image of Satan in John's Revelation is of a dragon, right? In chapter 12 of John's Revelation, there's a dragon that's like Leviathan. And basically the narrative, the visions go that the beast is in league with the dragon. And the beast is identified with the Emperor Nero, quite clearly, if you know your history of the time when you're reading through it. Then the author has the whore Babylon, Rome, riding on the beast as the imagery, right? You couldn't get a more thorough demonization of the Roman Empire than this, I don't think. Right? The imagery that's being used, using the idea of God's opponent, ultimate opponent, personified evil figure with a will opposed to God, and using that idea to negatively characterize a political power in your own time. So that's the second main function, rhetorical function, that Satan serves, right? There's the usage of Satan in different settings once you have this idea of a personified evil figure. Now that's only a glimpse into so much more, as you can imagine. You could have a whole series of lectures just on John's Revelation. You could have a whole series of lectures just on the Dead Sea Scrolls. You might even have a whole series of lectures on community rule of the Dead Sea Scrolls if you really wanted the nitty-gritty. But we just had to glimpse a few things, but hopefully you've got them. One is that we first see the emergence of a personified evil figure opposed to God in around 200 BCE. We first see a glimpse of people thinking like that. And that those ideas aren't just ideas in people's heads. There are some Judeans living together and living it out and feeling they're living in Belial's dominion, getting ready for the final battle when God will intervene and save the righteous and wipe out the wicked. And then you've also seen some of the rhetoric that goes around using the personified evil figure idea in order to deal with people, right? To deal with the people you don't like that are near you, and to deal with those far-off political powers that are sometimes nonetheless nearby, to demonize in both cases, and to say those people are on the side of Satan, obviously implying I'm on the side of God, as the rhetoric does that, right? So that's what I hope you got out of that quick scan through things. What questions do you have, though?